that cooperation that happened in 1945 will happen again in 2020?
Are people aware they are living through pivotal moments in history? And as a student, as a fan of history, 476 is always seen as a pivotal year. The last, when we had the last Roman emperor, but the Roman Empire went with a whimper. It's only looking back do we actually look at it and go, crumbs, something happened then. Eric, I believe there's a little bit of local difficulty in your side of the Atlantic in 70 something or another. That is a pivotal year in terms of just American history. If I was a regular rootin' tootin' person down in, let's say, Georgia, and it is not necessarily the 4th of July, because the news would have taken days to get to me back then, but let's say it's the 15th of July, would I have felt that this was the dawning of a great new age? I don't think so. Do we put too much store by dates? I'm using just the American, just using the 4th of July 1776 as an example. You need to unmute yourself there, Eric.
Thanks.
There you go.
I think we do put too much store in dates. I think it is a common human fallacy to miss what ended up being really important and to focus on things that ended up not being really important. One thing I know about kind of recent US history is that in the 70s, people were like, US empire is donezo, right? We're losing the Vietnam War, stagflation, our country is divided, right? The Kent State Massacre happened. And so I think people living in that time said, the US is going down. We're going to be relegated to being a second-rate power. I don't think in the UK, I'll speak on this briefly because I'm the Yank in the room. I don't think in the UK, there was a belief that as the United Kingdom was winning the Second World War, that it would spell the end, that would spell the end of the British Empire. So I think I worry that it is a common thing for anyone living in a given time, and us living in 2020, to see like we of the curves of history doing this. We're on this little track that looks like a straight line, and we go like, okay, let's project out that straight line, and we go, for example, we have a recent wave of lack of cooperation, or like kind of towards national individualism away from global cooperation. We say, well, if that continues for 100 years, we are toast, right? And I love that you asked this question, because I think it's a good opportunity for us to caution indulging too much in saying we're on this line right now and let's draw it out straight. I think the problem with history is that things happen to you that you didn't anticipate, right? Like no one could have guessed the big stuff that came in 2020, and who the gods only know what will happen in 2021. We may look back and go like, well, 2020 was just a sideshow. So that is the tough part. Now I know it's dodging the question a little bit, right? To take no responsibility for saying what's the impact 2020 is going to have on the world. But yes, to sum it up and actually answer your question, I do think it is a common thing for us to miss what's really important, and for us to think we're in a really important moment when we're not. But sometimes we do get it right. Right. Sometimes, sometimes you do get it right. I think, for example, when man landed on the moon, I think we said this is ushering in a brand new era of technology, and like the computation is going to race ahead and radically transform our lives in ways we didn't know. We were right. We couldn't have predicted what it would have been, but we knew it was going to be different.
All right. Now that's a lovely little end, and it's. What I need to say to everybody who's watching is you're going to have the opportunity to ask our esteemed panel a question or two. So this isn't just a case of me just rabbiting on. Sorry, that's British English, me talking at you all and whatever, and then asking questions of our panel. The whole reason why we're actually doing this on Zoom is so that you, the esteemed kind of like mass of people who are watching, can also ask a question also. So, right, Chris, I'm coming to you, sir. 1848, right? I'm a fanboy of history, right? And I go, right, and I'm trying to not be too Anglosphere about this, right? Because, you know, I could go 1066, etc., etc. But I'm going to put that to one side. 1848 has always been a year which, when I discovered that as a teenage fan of history, it blew my skirt up. You know, all these radical changes that happened in Europe, all these monarchies that were toppled, crowned heads of Europe getting in their carriages and scampering out of the palace, people waving red flags, or, you know, in terms of the German revolutionaries, it would be yellow, red and black flags and saying Vive la Revolution. I think it's fairly safe to say that people back in 1848 in continental Europe felt that they were living through a massive change. But 2 years later, all those crowned heads were back on their thrones, with the exception of Louis Philippe in France. But, you know, Napoleon Bonaparte was just around the corner. So how much can we look at 1848? Does it have any particular parallels with 2020?
I think it doesn't directly in the way that we'd assume. It's not a year where we can point to a load of successful revolutions and say they instituted a new form of government. I think what it did was show that there was a massive groundswell across Europe that said the old order of restored aristocracies, which had been sort of put in place after the Napoleonic Wars, were not meeting the needs of the new educated citizenry, which was beginning to sort of build to this mass market. But the idea of monarchy as the stability of government was very ingrained in Europe. So even the revolutionaries were still looking at a sort of evolution of the order that they were going to deal with. And I don't feel that 2020 is quite in the same place. I think Eric and Emma might, of course, have a particular view about how the situation in the USA shapes up. But I think in terms of revolutions across Europe, you know, we're just not seeing it, for all that we've seen more authoritarianism from people like Orban and, of course, Erdogan in Turkey. And the Arab Spring doesn't seem to have had long-lasting implications either. So I think it's more a case of 1848 is seen as maybe a bit of a lost opportunity for Europe, but I don't think it quite parallels with what we're seeing today.
Okay, it was great that you brought a parallel to the United States. Emma, you're a great student of American politics. Many people have said, and I said within my setup, that 2020 feels like a rerun to a degree of 1968, which was the year which American cities famously burnt. Up until that point, American politics had been relatively liberal. We had Johnson passing civil rights legislation, the Voting Act, you know, African Americans in the Deep South could actually go and vote. But the consensus when we look at 1968, now the political census, is that Middle America thought a step had gone too far, you know, with these rights or disorder on the street. Why do you think that Black Lives Matter, so far, you know, it's July the 19th, has not necessarily suffered from that same backlash? Let's not try and be too partisan about this and whatever. Let's just try and look at it in the wider kind of historical kind of process. What was different about America then and now, considering that in terms of taking a Whiggish view of history, and David was right to bring that up before, that arguably Black Lives Matter right now in 2020 is another manifestation of the civil rights movement in 1968.
Okay, well, I'm going to answer the question, I promise. But I'm also going to go back to what our initial essay question was, because we've done an awful lot of looking backwards from 2020 and very little of looking at how we think the future is going to see.
I was going to get there, Emma. Trust me, it's in my notes. Go on.
So yeah, basically, I'm going to expand this out a little bit. I think the 20th century was seen as the American century, what it's generally known as. That's a Western concept for a lot of people, but the Americans kind of, by the end of the 20th century, the Cold War was over. It was looking like America had won. America was hegemonic economically, and basically was the world's police, and imposing a certain type of democratic liberalism around the world, or at least using that premise to go around the world at perhaps more economic liberalism than democratic liberalism was what was actually imposed. You can argue either way. But here's my thing about what is going to happen in the coming years. And a lot of that will be about who wins the argument in America now. So this is coming back to what you just asked me. There is a real tendency on both the right and the left extremes in American politics to be very inward looking at the moment. And if that continues, America is going to shrink in terms of its international influence and become too centered on its own self. So if the people who are supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, are they doing that because they want a better America to be a better guardian of the world, or are they doing that on an inward-looking basis? And I think that's probably a bit of both. You'll definitely have people, say, on the far left who don't want America involved in any war ever, no matter what else is happening in the world. But I think if we look at what people will be asking about 2020, that nobody is asking in 2020, or at least not nearly enough people. I want to know why we don't think they wouldn't be asking why the hell aren't they doing anything about the Uyghurs in China? And if you want a historical comparison, this is being called by Jewish newspapers in the UK at the moment the second Holocaust. So I think that is the question that a lot of people will be asking. Now, hopefully they'll be asking it because we have drawn the world back into a liberal democratic tradition. But that's not the trajectory we're on. We may be moving into a very authoritarian century.
Emma, you, as always, you were right to just make sure that I was keeping this whole discussion on track, and that we were acutely aware of the essay title which I set you all, which is, of course, fundamentally we're looking forward, but to understand the present and the future, we need to look back. But we do need to end this section by exactly doing that. Let's look forward. David, your podcast, The History of England, let's say up until maybe the 1980s, if podcasting was even a thing when, you would have had a very, let's say, bullish, let's say the 1960s, if you're English, a bullish view of England's place in history, but also its future. You might have said, okay, the empire is gone now, right? But you know what? We still, punch above our weight internationally. England / the United Kingdom wasn't part of the EU back then, but we were looking towards that, etc. One of the things which is beset definitely the political left in England, in Britain, is a sense of pessimism since the 1960s, or not of, let's say, automatic progress. It's hard for us to imagine what England and the United Kingdom might be like in 2120, but I'm going to ask you to do that now. Bearing in mind that we've just had Brexit, we have the Scots looking at not only just devolution but independence, etc. With all the things which have happened in 2020, will they act as an accelerant for how you see the future, or are they just a diversion? Paint a picture of England in 2021 for us.
What kind of a question is that, Royfield?
The type of question of which I've posed to you, sir, because I know, right, you're going to stroke your big beard and you're going to hit me with a very thought out and erudite answer.
I read a book recently on futurology, and I think in that book it said that the vast majority of our predictions about the future turn out to be wrong.
Is that
Absolutely.
Margaret Hefferan's book?
Sorry?
Is that Margaret Heffernan's book?
I don't know. I think it was by a chap called Gary Hammer. It was years ago when I was selling books. Anyway, but there might have been that one too. Anyway, so you know, it kind of illustrates how incredibly difficult it is to predict. I think, I mean, for me, maybe because of the way I am and what my view of the future probably affects, you know, the answer is that I don't see how the world can survive without being more interconnected and working more closely together.
You're going to work England into your answer at any minute now, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. I'll just check
in a couple of hours, actually. I mean, obviously, I know that things like the Belt and Road projects from China maybe give the lie to that. You know, when you look at the Uyghur vote, for example, Emma, which I think was absolutely the right thing to bring up, the UK couldn't even get China to be censored for that appalling activity that's going on by the UN, because the China Belt and Road project has changed the political dynamics within the UN. But I think that international cooperation will reassert itself in the face of what are global challenges and becoming more global challenges. So we could have predicted the pandemic, actually. We didn't know when it would happen, but we knew at some point that it would happen. We know that climate change is a major problem. We know that we have experience of international cooperation working. So my view is that actually by 2120, we will look back on the world. For the UK, I think the UK will break up. And I foresee a future where England, Wales, Scotland will be able to exist as individual nations. And that's important because a nation is the basis of liberal democracy. And they will exist within transnational organizations. That is my rather optimistic and highly wrong view.
Eric, obviously, where Britain leads, America always follows. So David says that he can see the end of the United Kingdom as a constituent whole. So obviously, we're going to end up with not necessarily 50 individual states that will look back at 2020 being the end of some golden age, or maybe it's the start of a new liberal independent future. I don't know. Right? What do the political strands of the early 20th century, where did they point us to, specifically looking at it through an American lens?
I think that the biggest thing we're going to be talking about in 100 years about 2020 is the United States being in a debt situation that it's not been in before, and the dollar being something that we can't just continue to rely on and borrow against. It's going to force the United States, I think, to become much more cooperative with the rest of the world. It's going to have to start playing ball with with creditors in a way that it never has before. I think this is going to dramatically change the U.S. outlook and the U.S. attitude globally. It's also going to mean that the United States is going to have to further decrease. And I think it's a myth that the United States has been, largely speaking, growing its military spending as a percent of GDP. It just keeps going down since 1990. And it's going to have to further decrease that. It's going to have to invest more. The U.S. is going to have to invest a lot more in social social spending. It's going to have to raise taxes. So it's going to mean a dramatically different United States in terms of its ability to just throw money around on the international stage. I think that's going to force the United States to become more of a team player. And I think, along with David, I'm optimistic. I think this is a good thing, even though it's going to be very painful for my wallet because my taxes are going to go up. I don't think the United States is going to break up. I don't think it's actually particularly at risk, in part because the divisions of the United States aren't along state lines so much, right? Like Texas could go blue this year. Georgia could go blue this year. We've got divisions in terms of what areas are high population density versus low population density. It's very hard to break up a nation based on those lines. If we were ethnically divided like the UK and we had, Scots to the north of us and English to the south, that would be different. So I think the US is going to be.
But Berwick, you raise an interesting point then. I'm sorry, I'm kind of bending down here. One of the things which is really stark about America since the age of Reagan is that Americans have been self-sorting, haven't they? That if you are liberal and you are from, let's say, a red state and you are young, you'll probably go move somewhere coastal or to a bigger city. So America has been self-segregating politically. It has.
A little bit. I think we're focusing a little bit too much on the tech class because the tech class makes a lot of noise, but it's a pretty small class in the United States, or the ultra educated elite. I also think that actually one of the things, a little thing about this pandemic that I think we're going to be talking about is how it killed the office for the intellectual class. Like the working office. And so people are going to get the heck out of New York, out of San Francisco, out of Boston, where they can't afford rent, even though, because they're saddled with student debt. And even though they're making $120,000 a year, they can't afford rent. And it's already started to happen. These wealthy, educated liberals are moving to Boise and Austin and Chattanooga and Nashville, Charleston. So I think we're moving back towards a trend of remixing the United States, and I also think that's a good thing.
Okay, very last question before I throw this out to the listeners, Chris. The age of Victoria is, if not the birth of the European nation state, it's definitely we see the decline of empire, even though it's masked by the treaties at the end of the First World War, where the British and the French carve up the Ottoman dominions, but they politically and economically can't really hold on to them, because that spark which starts really with the age of Napoleon in terms of national consciousness, of which has an expression in 1848, is really the clarion call politically all throughout Europe. National identity. What will that mean in 2120?
So I think it touches also on a point sort of that Eric and David were also talking about, which is what is a national identity? A lot of Victorian Britain and Queen Victoria herself, a lot of her time was focused on building the artificial identity of the United Kingdom. And a lot of, ironically, some of the modern English and Scottish nationalist movements actually pick up on imagery that was created by the Victorians to describe mythic pasts. And certainly economic first mover advantage and technological first mover advantage propelled Europeans into some very dominant positions, but they were aided by a demographic explosion, the likes of which we haven't seen in human history, and we are still dealing with the consequences of it. Now, I think what we're seeing in 2020 is the process of the unraveling of some of the agreed national identities. And that process can either be a process of transition, in which case it can be a positive experience, nations and societies within them evolve over time. But there is always a danger that if you unravel the nation state too quickly and into too sharp a divides within it, that it can lead to almost a form of social collapse. And you can see things that split into dreadful ethnic tensions like you saw in the Balkan Wars. And once you get into those states, it's very hard, having dismantled the institutions and the national myths that hold disparate peoples together, to stop it and put the brakes on. And before you know it, you can end up with perfectly normal people who, I've met some of them when I worked with refugees, who were talking about how their neighbors that they had known for decades one day woke up, pulled out a machete or a gun, and decided to kill them. And that is always the danger of the unraveling of the big states and the big sort of power alignments in world politics, that it can spin out of control and it's not easy to recover.
Wise words there. And I went to Sarajevo just last year, and stories of neighbours turning against neighbour of which they were intermarried with, were utterly legion, that all of a sudden those familial bonds had just gone. The fact that the glue of neighbours had completely gone because something else had been thrown into the mix. So this is the time where, if you would like to ask a question to the panel, this is your moment. So is there anybody who's got a question? I know a lot of people have got their cameras off. You're a shy bunch. You don't want us to actually to see the whites of your eyes. But if you do have a question, why don't you switch on your camera now? Give us a wave. Now I think we're looking at you, Caroline Webber. All of a sudden you've switched your camera on. So Caroline, I'm asking you to unmute. If you can unmute yourself, why don't you ask your question away, Caroline?
Sure. So first I want to say it's so great to see David Crowther. I did go to the Intelligence Speech Conference in person last year, and I also signed up for his trip. And I will say, David, that one thing that's making me optimistic for the future is that I've signed up for the trip that you're hosting in 2021.
Fantastic.
Very much looking forward to that. Although I'm also going to take out trip insurance just in case. The question that I had for the panel, sort of about the pendulum theory, and I'm not a historian. That's why I listen to you guys. I love listening. My brother's actually a historian, but I'm not. But I know that there are some theories that history is like a pendulum and that it swings one way, swings the other way. The thing that crosses my mind in terms of that is the climate change thing, because we may say, oh, in 100 years or 20 years or next year, the pendulum's going to swing back. But if you do have a sort of a catastrophe like climate change, it might not matter that the pendulum is going to swing back on some of this stuff. We may all just end up, in a very, very bad situation.
Who wants to take on that question? With the pendulum theory of history, Barack Obama basically says, I'm going to mangle the quote now, but the arc of something gets somewhere in the end, and blah blah blah. So, but who wants to answer that question? Which one of our panel? Hold your hand up, and we can start with you, David. All right, you're up, sir.
I don't know why I'm doing this. I'm doing it really because it's very nice to see Caroline. So again, I think the point you make, Caroline, about climate change, for me, is why who wrote that book, This Changes Everything. Because it seems to me that climate change is not really like stuff we've seen before. I may be over panicking, but the comment earlier about, or the discussion earlier about continuity and discontinuity, I think it was Eric, I absolutely agree with 99% of the time. In actual fact, so much of history is about continuity rather than discontinuity. And we look at things like, the Reformation and so on, and we think, hey, there's a big discontinuity. But in actual fact, there's much more continuity than there is discontinuity. Climate change is different, isn't it? we could all die, but but less cataclysmically. The divisions across the world could be radically made radically world. And I don't believe in the pendulum theory of history. I don't believe in the cyclical theory of history. I don't believe in the linear progression history. It seems to me there are a number of factors operating on human history, such as population change, for example, and you have to understand how those are operating in order to think about the future. Is that an answer?
Caroline, okay, you're happy. Does anybody else want to chime in on that? Eric.
I like David. Don't think of history as a pendulum. In terms of how I think about, I tend to lean towards David's Whig style of approach, but I think of it more like a stock market. Like, it does this, but it's been going up, right? And sometimes it goes right, and then starts going up again. And but to David's point, and sorry, actually, Caroline, to your point, it's one of those things that, well, like if the damage is done, it's going to take 100 years to undo it. You can't just go like, okay, well, we stopped doing that dumb thing, we can continue on. I don't necessarily think, though, that we need to have a pendulous event in order to take better action on climate change. The way that I've thought about it is that we seem to be poised to get extremely lucky. And the reason I say we're extremely lucky is in particular because the technology that largely speaking, the free-ish markets of the United States and the European Union and China is not a free market, but the capitalistic interests, the money-driven interests, are creating technology that is affordable, that allows us to be able to hit the button and go, right? And there will be damage, right? We're going to look back in 100 years, be like, oh my God, we should have, we knew about this 20 years ago, and look at everything we could have prevented. But World War I and World War II and the Cold War happened throughout the 20th century, and we're still sitting here going like, ooh, there's still like smoke, right? There's still like ashes and smoke rising off the landscapes of Europe. But as a species, we survived. I predict that a bunch of accidents, and history is very accident prone. I think a bunch of accidents that happened this year are going to bring about a strong Democratic majority in the United States. I think that Democratic majority is ready to hit the big button and go. And one of the reasons in particular is we'll have very large unemployment. Democrats are going to say, okay, green jobs, go, build a bunch of stuff. And I think the EU is going to say, oh, Christ, finally, let's go. And it will be, rather than through, and obviously the US will rejoin Paris, right? That's a button we can just hit again. I do think we're going to look back and say, through these weird accidents that made conservatives very unpopular in parts of Europe and the United States, the big wealthy nations that have a lot of impact here. We're going to be talking in a year about all this action that's starting to happen, and we're going to be very excited about it. That's what I think.
I can feel some of our conservative friends who are probably listening to this cast go to your analysis there. Lisa, you came out of the dark, you unmasked yourself, so I presume you have a question for the panel.
Yes, I do. First, I want to say, from your lips to God's ears, Eric, you can only hope. I want to go back to something David said. First of all of you guys are some of my favorite podcasts, so this is like fangirl time. Anyway, love all your podcasts. You said something about having a hard time having hope right now, and I've always been a really optimistic person. But I was right. I was a little girl during the riots, like not far from this. I still have, like, I hear sirens, and I'm still like, oh, sirens. That's how bad it was. But I always, after that, when things got better, I thought there was hope. Right now, it's very hard to be hopeful. One of the reasons I love history and listening to history is I look back and think, well, they got through that. humanity survived. They got through this. We can survive this. Right now, it's really hard to do that. And I have a daughter, a 20-year-old daughter, and I know you have kids. I don't know the rest of you. How do you talk to your children? What are you talking to them about the future? Because they're the ones who are going to have to be dead in 20, 30 years or whatever. But I worry about the
That's a great question there, Lisa. Considering that we've talked about the death of liberal in the classic meaning sense of the word, hope, and the Whiggish progression of history. If you utterly believe that we are going into perilous times, whether it's to do with climate change or economic and social dislocation, how do we enthuse the young? I have a little bit of an idea, but who wants to go on that? How about you, Chris Packham? Are you a father, sir?
I am, yeah. I've got two lovely children. Yeah.
Well, okay. So how do you put them to bed at night, considering we're living through 2020, and to many people, the global hair is on fire, sir?
So surprisingly, despite what I've said, I am actually fairly optimistic about the state of the world today and its overall progress. It's not to underestimate the problems, because I think they are enormous and I think they are absolutely pressing. And I think we have been dangerously complacent over some things like climate change, rampant inequality, structural racism. You can make the list. But as I always say to my listeners on the podcast, if you could tell the Victorians how things turned out now, they would think that we were living in the promised utopia that they had been expecting. And they would quite often probably say they'd find us quite soft and quite insecure. And in some ways, we have been living in this kind of fantasy bubble after 50, 60 years after the Second World War, which is largely floating on an ocean of oil. A return to a less stable world is perhaps just a return to what humans have had to deal with throughout history. But as I say to my children, we have more knowledge, more people, more food, and more resource availability than any other civilization at any time in human history. And even if our challenges are much greater, I still believe that we have the capacity and the deep knowledge to actually overcome them. What will make us fail is either being afraid to try or thinking that the solution to the problems is to save societies as they are structured today in the exact way they are, because that's not going to happen. The challenge and the test of us as a species will be to build this new, different, but hopefully better society in 100 years' time.
Stirring words, sir. Right, I'm going to throw one last one in from me before I go for one last question from the audience. If we're specifically looking at Black Lives Matter, it's been quite marked how many companies, how many organizations have basically got behind that movement. And that has then forced, let's say, politicians that, let's say, weren't necessarily that attuned to the anguish of African Americans, basically to go, okay, there is something going on here. Because companies, Nike, for example, or even in the United Kingdom, Tetley Tea, you can't get more English than that company, have basically said, no, we are getting behind this. Could we see a situation whereby in 2020, Emma Burnell is shaking her head furiously, I haven't got to the end of my question. Could we see a situation whereby, I'm playing devil's advocate, could we see a situation whereby that almost we have some kind of public referenda through corporations, through moneyed interests in 2020? Could we see the diminution of national governments everywhere, and that literally all they do is kind of rubber stamp and maybe a little bit of regulation here or there, but actually we live in the society of the consumer? Emma Burnell, you looked horrified before I even got halfway through my question. 2020, we're not citizens, we are consumers, and we vote through our wallets and purses.
Okay, well, there's so much to unpack there that I disagree with. It's going to take me a little while, but I'm going to start off by imploring you to read a brilliant article written recently by the journalist Helen Lewis called Woke Capitalism. And yeah, what it does is unpack how easy it is for these corporations to look like the good guys. Tetley Tea send one tweet and they're suddenly a woke corporation. Tell me what their gender pay gap is. Tell me how many black senior executives they have. That's the hard work. Woke capitalism is throwing a rainbow flag over your thing and doing absolutely nothing to change your working practices. So it's absolutely essential that we don't fall for it. And that leads me on to your idea that government should just be there to rubber stamp the things that consumers have done through corporations. When we only have about 3 corporations left, they're all owned by Unilever, or they're all owned by Amazon, they're all owned by Google. There isn't this choice, this amazing consumer choice that we have, because actually they're all basically 3 guys in Silicon Valley, one in bloody China. And if the idea that those are the people with our best interests at heart is just completely unacceptable. We need to fight for democracy, not give up on it and try and find another way of doing it through consumerism.
Okay, well that told me. Good job I didn't believe my question. I was just throwing it out there just to be provocative. Right, we're going to wrap this up, folks. So, Catherine Ruiz, do you have a question for our panel? Because you switched your cam on, Catherine.
Can I say it's great to have all the questions from women? Yay!
Well, I hope I can hold up to the other great questions. It's kind of related to what you were just talking about, Roifield and Emma, and it's about my feeling that in America there's been this sort of reaction, this Trump reaction, and Make America Great Again. This idea of going backwards to a point where we were better off. It's everything is individually facing, and I feel that that's what's related to these ideas of these companies saying that they're in favor of Black Lives Matter. They're in favor of people buying their products if it looks like, they're going to support something that might be popular and is catching on. I wish it was different. Hopefully there are some people in those companies that are different, and certainly I'm all for them supporting those movements, but it feels like these changes are going to take people self-sacrificing related to climate change and changes that we need to make. We're going to have to give some things up and face a maybe slightly more austere future with not as much, cool communication devices and whatnot. What will it take if people won't even wear masks in the face of this deadly disease for each other, if not for themselves, if they sense that it's a little, difficult for them? What kind of thing will it take? What is the shift that's going to shift 2020 into moving that forward versus us just being so individually minded? Not that any of you guys are. Yay, Eric.
Go, Eric. You answer the question, Eric.
So I've been one of the things I've been obsessing here in the United States is like I just can't help but look at all sorts of polls every day because I see this tidal shift happening in the United States, and in particular, I'm really glad you brought the mask thing up because I used to be a consultant, so I'd fly around to factories and I'd help fix them, and I'd sit there with my boss and I'd go, look, the data obviously supports making this decision. It's going to be so good for the factory. This factory is like at risk of closing, and the factory manager is just refusing to listen to me. What do I do? And my boss would say, define a short failure period for them and let them fail, right? And say, look, if you don't do X, Y will happen, and it will happen in this short period of time. Let them know they will fail. And they will learn. I forget who it was. There was some like talk show host or some moron that Trump retweeted that was like, everyone's lying to you. This whole COVID thing is fake. And then like literally 3 days after Trump retweeted it, he said, oh my gosh, my son has the coronavirus and he's in the hospital and I was wrong. Right, and that's not enough. But I think the United States has this short cycle failure period that is going to be painful but not crippling. So I'm actually, and it's one of those that, like, obviously I'm not. It's what's hard about this is it sounds like I'm rooting for people to get hurt and die, but what I think we're going to end up with is probably 500,000 people in the United States have died by the end of the year. But I think it's going to be so broad, and in particular, it's going to hit the places with the most anti-maskers, right, by definition. And enough people are going to know someone who got very, very sick or died that there's going to be this like, moment. Now, are we going to learn broader lessons from this? A little bit. I think one of the reasons the Pride movement works so well in the United States is that people realize, I know people who are LGBT. And that, I think, more than data, especially for Americans, for some reason, like stories do it for us. George Floyd, like being on video was the thing that did it for us. All the data about Black Americans being oppressed by police, nobody cared. Or at least not enough of us cared. But seeing one person on video got Black Lives Matter to go from literally underwater to have like vast majority support by even white Americans. So I think the thing that was going to change for Americans is we're going to get pummeled with these short enough that we aren't able to generationally forget, unlike climate change. Something like the coronavirus is this short failure period that's going to be very acute, very painful. And I think that it is going to, like, I don't necessarily think, like, I don't want to make a broad thing about individualism versus collectivism, but at least like kind of like being a little bit more forward thinking. I think that lesson cycle is going to be something that the United States takes to heart. And the reason I believe it is because even with the coronavirus, more and more and more Americans think that the anti-maskers are dumb, that we need to all be wearing masks. Like the support for it is actually rising dramatically and quickly. You just have this stubborn 20% of people who are just like, ruining it for the rest of us. But I do think it's going to create a broad, I think what we're seeing happen is the first time in like 30 years, the creation of a broad coalition in the United States that realizes that, that all of these, like basically Americans are changing their minds. There's this critical 30% of Americans who are actually changing their minds. I think and I think the fact that there's an election coming up is great timing. It's why I'm so optimistic about this year.
All right, so 2120. We're going to sign out now because we've just done just over an hour. But Eric, for me, you raise a really valid philosophical point, and really embracing of the challenges of the future. At the heart of each society is how much do we believe that we are a set of individuals that just happen to have a nationality, or are we a group of actors within a community? And surely if we're looking at, let's say, the way to combat climate change, you need a more collectivist mindset from on high, but then also on low by citizens, because it could well be that from day in, day out, I don't really see any change in the climate. Nobody does, day in, day out. But our grandparents maybe says, you know what, that lake used to freeze over, it doesn't anymore, type of thing, right? So that's when we need our elected officials to have a further view of the future, and for us to be able to say, look, they have our best interests at heart. And it seems to me that the societies that struggle with that generally are the ones that believe that everyone's just an individual. You just go do your own thing. I'm not wearing a mask, so what? Type of thing, blah, blah, blah. So with that as a final thought, are we then potentially in 2120 looking at not only the rise of somewhere like China just because there's a load of Chinese and they build a whole load of stuff, but also because their view, and I'm not talking about communism now, I'm talking about Confucianism, Taoism, etc. Are we looking at, and Emma's shaking her head again, we're going to come back to everybody before we wrap this up, are we looking potentially at those societies, those communities that believe in looking backwards to look forwards as being the ones who are going to be the ones who can actually take hold of pandemics, of climate change, and of the vagaries of the future? Emma, you were shaking your head. You're going to give us an answer, then we'll go through the panel, and then we're going to sign off.
I think you have a very rosy-eyed view of
I ask half of these questions just to rile up debate. Don't necessarily assign my thoughts and beliefs to the questions which I pose as host. Stop it.
I mean, the truth is, we do need a more cooperative century, and I think both Chris, all the other panelists made that point. And what I didn't have a chance to come back and say is, I think that is true, but don't be under the illusion that nations working together will necessarily do so in causes that we agree with and in ways that we agree with. If I had children, I would be making sure they were learning Mandarin right now. Not because I believe the Chinese are going to solve our problems because they believe in Buddhism and Confucianism, but because I believe the Chinese have bought most of, a very, very large amount of the world's economy and are doing so to be an economic superpower. And they do not share our values.
All right, so the Chinese don't share our values. Chris Fernandez-Packham, in 1820, the largest economy on planet Earth was the Chinese economy. The 19th century saw a rapid decline in Chinese GDP. Surely, the world is just reasserting itself. It's going back to its old axis, with China being the big I am. Come 2021, it's all going to be academic. As Emma says, we're all going to be speaking Mandarin or maybe some dialect of Cantonese, I don't know. And the Chinese century started in, I don't know, approximately 2003 or so, when it became the world's second largest economy. It's just going to remain so in 2120. Tell me I'm wrong, Chris.
Actually, I think I will tell you you're wrong.
Thank you.
And I think the reason for it is because there is a degree of cultural commonality that has not existed in human history before. In the 19th century, the differences someone from Britain would have noticed between themselves, just in their style of dress and their things that they ate, just traveling through Europe, would have been quite marked. Never mind how a British person visiting Australia for the first time, or South Africa or China, would have noticed the difference in those civilizations. Today, most people on Earth will wear jeans or tracksuits or suits. Most civilizations around the world, for better or for worse, are now using the technologies, systems, and structures that were developed in the 19th century European imperial period. And whatever China turns into in terms of its political power, it is doing so using in large part things that we in the West relate to, using westernized technologies that are then being incorporated into the Chinese economy and developed in their own way according to their own diverse culture and background. But fundamentally, it is far less alien to us today to look at the Western Asia than it would have been at any other time in human history. I think there will be an increased interchange between the various powers of the world. And I think certainly as American power recedes perhaps to a more regional basis, we will see an increase in Chinese power and an increase perhaps in some kind of Russian East Eurasian power bloc. I don't know. We will see more competition for energy. But I think fundamentally, what we will be looking at is humans adopting and adapting the best from around the world. And we will have much more commonality than we do difference.
David Crowther, we're going to end up with you, sir. You are going to finish the whole kit and caboodle, which is our first intelligence speech. I'll go on, Eric, very quickly, sir. You've got 2 minutes to counter what Chris said. Very quickly.
Well, no, not counter. I just want my part, because I briefly want to defend individualism, because I don't think the anti-mask crowd, etc., is an individualist crowd. The way they act, they're extremely collectivist. There is one way of doing things, and if you don't do it, they're angry. They're mad that you're wearing a mask. That's not individualism.
No, but surely at the heart, though, of their political socio credo is the fact that I, as an individual, do not need to take orders from the state. I, as an individual, have my own agency, etc. You can't tell me what to do.
I think they're anti-state. They're anti-government. I don't think they're anti-collective. I don't think they're anti-tribe. I think like the peak individualism was Voltaire's saying, "I disagree with you, but I will defend with my life your right to say it." And so that's my only point about individualism versus collectivism. I think they're saying the state is wrong. The state is brainwashing you. They're not saying, yeah, I know this is safe, but I don't bother. And I think that's more of the core of the problem in the United States is that we have two different worlds, and one of them is sitting here saying everything you hear from doctors and professionals and experts is wrong. It's a lie. It's out to it's out to hurt you in some way. That's the thing that needs to change, rather than the United States somehow becoming more collectivist, which it won't anytime soon. And my only other thought on China and Russia in particular, I think Russia's hosed. Economically, demographically, it's toast. It's going down. But there's nothing playing in Russia's favor geopolitically or economically right now. China's a little bit different. But I tend to agree a little bit more with Chris that ultimately China's influence must be somewhat limited, and a big part of it for a very, very long time, and a big part of it is just because the Chinese government is so abhorrent to so many peoples and societies that I think those, are we due for perhaps another Cold War type thing? Maybe. Is it going to be the Chinese century? No. No more than the 20th century was the Soviet century, even though they were the number 2 big power on the block. And I think it's ultimately because the peoples of the peoples of the wider world are going they will reject China, and also because Chinese ambition is Chinese global ambition is purely economical at this point. They are not an evangelist. To your point about actually Confucianism, they are not an evangelist power. They, unlike the Soviet Union, they're not trying to say, okay, the whole world has to be like us. We are at war with the whole world to make them communist. It's never been China's way. It is not China's way, and it won't be. So they're going to act very different.
David, we're going to end up with you, right? And I feel good news, David, for 2120. China is not going to be the big global power. The United States has had its day. It's going to be England again, isn't it? We've got tea, we have cricket, we have the weather for it, right? And we're kind of rocket fueled by the fact that we have the world's language, English. So surely the 22nd century is going to be the century of the English. Discuss. You need to unmute yourself before you just start discussing.
It is true, as you say, Royfield, that we do have, we did invent the greatest game invented by man. And that is a good point. I think we're massively over time. So just a little thing, I go back to something somebody else said, which was, a couple of people said, is that, look, if you look back at history, actually what you learn is that although we don't learn perfectly, you do learn stuff. So the way we've responded to this challenge of the pandemic is to think, right, we're going to have to invest a lot of money here. There's none of the stuff about free market economics that England inflicted on the Irish famine, for example. So we have learned stuff. And if I think about the divided nature of political discourse at the moment, if you look back at the 18th century, you look back in 19th century, political discourse in the UK has always been vicious. There's nothing of this thing about England being all polite. It's none of that. 18th century in particular, it's vicious. And yet we found solutions and we moved forward. So I think we should end on a positive note. I don't agree about China, but I think we should end on a positive note that we will solve these problems. We will work together as necessary to solve them. So that's my Pollyanna-ish thought for the day.
Emma Burnell, Chris Fernandez-Packham, Eric Fogg, David Crowther, and everybody watching and listening to us today. I'd like to thank you for being part of the very first Intelligent Speech monthly get-together. There'll be another one next month, hence they're monthly. Don't know what the topic will be, haven't thought about it yet, don't know who the panellists will be, but they'll be similarly as erudite and as informed, and probably not as quite good looking as a panel you've had today. Thank you for your time, people from all over planet Earth, because we've had Brits, we've had Americans, and I think we've even had a Canadian or two watching us today. Take care, everybody. Look after yourself and be good to each other. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
There you go. Emma Burnell, you're still here.
Yes, sorry, I'm just.
Yeah, you hadn't gone back. You hadn't switched off quickly enough. Neither of you, Natalie. You're still here too. So how was that, Emma? How was it, Natalie? You can unmute yourself now, Natalie. Now the broadcast has ended. We need some listener feedback, Natalie, if you're still there, or unless you've gone off to make yourself a cup of tea or coffee.
We are well over time. She's perfectly within her rights.
Yeah, absolutely. That went all right, didn't it?
It was good. I mean, I'm not sure I was the right person for that panel. It was way too history heavy for me. I couldn't really.
Listen, shush. It's good to have you on, and also, it was good to have you on. Stop it. It was history heavy, and I always had to kind of like slightly pivot to the political and stuff. But you're always good, and I like it when you call me out on when I'm just saying things just because you just got to stoke things up a little. I was just shaking and going, no. Before you even get there, Royfield.
I read that Helen Lewis piece, and it's really so brilliant that I was just and everything you were saying was exactly what she was arguing against. So I was like, right, I'm just going to steal all of Helen's points now.
Cool. What are you doing for the rest of your evening? Anything?
I'm going to watch Mockingbird Part 2, Hunger Games, the last Hunger Games film.
Are those actually really any good?
They're enjoyable. I was having a very, very interesting discussion with my dissertation supervisor, bizarrely, on Twitter last night, where I said, I think these are actually quite conservative, or at the very least anti-metropolitan liberal. And he was like, oh, that because he's an urbanist. And he was like, oh, that's really interesting. Tell me what you mean. So we had this long discussion about it. It was really And so I've promised to report back on tonight's film. It's like he's giving me homework all over again.
I kind of like when I went off to college, I wanted to make films. I did audiovisual design because I wanted to be a filmmaker. I wanted to be the black English Derek Jarman that wasn't gay. That's what I wanted. I wanted to make artsy fartsy films.
Isn't Derek Jarman English?
Yeah, but like he's gay. But I said, but he wasn't gay. Yeah, he wasn't gay. All right. So like Caravaggio and stuff he did and whatever. And I just wanted to make artsy fartsy films and stuff. And even though I don't think I'm a cultural snob anymore, I do. Oh crumbs! Wait a minute. We've got to switch us off because we were still on Facebook. Oh crumbs! Let me just switch that off. Hello everybody who's watching us on Facebook.
You could all tell me I wasn't the right person.
Oh crumbs! Here we go.